We heard a glimpse from our children this morning about friendship. But if you think about being about 5 years old, your best friend is the one you are playing with right this very minute. My girls would routinely meet somebody at the park, play for an hour with them, and on the way home, they would talk endlessly about their best friend. And I would sometimes inquire with them, "So what was your best friend's name?" They would casually say, "I don't know," because it didn't really matter. Their best friend was the person they had just spent an hour running and giggling with. Come around middle school, a best friend is somebody who gets you, you can be yourself with. And sometimes these people move away, and that's painful. Sometimes these people find new friends, and that can be painful. And sometimes they can be casually mean and kind of nasty, and we know that can be painful. But at that time, having friends is critical to fitting in, to belonging. And sometime around adulthood, making friends becomes a little bit harder. We no longer all land in the same situation, like starting a new year at school, and it's not quite as natural of a setting where everyone is looking to make new friends. So you kind of got to put yourself out there. You might find yourself in a setting and you're like, who looks like somebody I might want to talk to? And, sometimes you talk to somebody and it works out great, and sometimes you just have a casual conversation and you know they're not going to be a great friend. And sometimes you make a friend and they drift apart. And sometimes even friends as adults can be kind of nasty, I hate to say. In our gospel story today, Jesus is continuing to talk with his disciples, who we know to be in his close circle of friends, in what we know to be the farewell discourse. So it's this final stretch of teachings that Jesus is doing just before his crucifixion. And what Sharon just read for us picks up immediately after last week's reading, where Jesus said, "I am the vine, you are the branches," and he talks about abiding, about remaining together with Jesus. So today we listen to Jesus tell his disciples, look, before you were servants. And because we're getting super close to the crucifixion part, of just a few chapters earlier was the Last Supper scene in John, and Jesus had talked to his disciples about being servants. It was during the washing of their feet. And he said, you have to serve one another as I am serving you. Now that doesn't stop me remaining true, but today Jesus says, I'm inviting you to something else. I'm inviting you to be friends. Now, we are getting super close to the crucifixion part of the story, and he's saying, look, I have taught you everything I know how to teach you. I've taught you all about God. I've shown you how to do it. Now, my friends, it's up to you. You've got this. And he goes even further to say, love one another. That's what you are to do. Love one another. That's it. Super easy. Super hard. And he goes a little bit further and he says, not only the best way to do this is to lay down your life for your friend. What? Now, we sit here knowing the story of Jesus, right? We know that it starts with his birth. In the middle, we've got some teaching. At the end, we get his death and later his resurrection. So if we're hearing it, though, as though we don't know the next part, we might be shocked by this ask of the best way to be a friend is to lay down your life for them. Now, assuredly, we don't lay down our life all the time in a very literal sense, right? We're all still sitting here. But it's worth pondering, what does that look like to have that much love for someone else. You all are perhaps not in the same circles of Facebook groups and those sorts of things as my world, but it seems like everybody I know was paying close attention to the United Methodist General Conference this past week, wherein they have finally changed the hurtful language around LGBT persons. This has been a long time fighting. They have been separating. It has been, ongoing for a long time. So I was watching this unfold, and I was continuing to remember our United Church of Christ story around open and affirming. So we have done this work long time before our United Methodist siblings. We still have work to do. We are not all the way there. But we began ordaining openly gay persons in the 70s. We affirmed equal marriage in 2005. We've been doing work to widen our inclusion of our transgender siblings. And this movement within our United Church of Christ has sort of been repeatedly laying down our lives kind of a thing. My first church I served had a number of retired clergy in the congregation, and one of those persons was the Reverend Henry Hayden. And I had the great privilege of, having lunch with these retired people and hearing their stories. And he was telling me the story of being the mentoring pastor for the Reverend Bill Johnson, who was the first openly gay man to be ordained in the United Church of Christ in 1972. And he proceeded to tell me a little bit about how that went. And he said, Iona, if you're not getting death threats, you're probably not doing it right. And I looked at him, I said, excuse me? He said, well, you're probably not doing it right if you're not. Confession, I am not doing it right. But he talked about how he was standing with Bill Johnson, and he was advocating for his ordination at a time when it was not a slam dunk, and he was getting death threats for his stance at that point in time. A literal willingness to lay down one's life. He clearly lived. He went on to tell me the story about it. But I think of us in our United Church of Christ every time we make a concerted effort to use the right pronouns. For many of us, this is a struggle. We struggle with doing that well. And every time we do it, we are sort of metaphorically laying down our lives for inclusion. We are working toward widening our love, even when it's not popular, to include others. I also heard a great story this week about the band U2 that talks about being on tour in the late 1980s. And at that point in time, there was some controversy in Arizona around observing MLK Day. Can you imagine? Anyway, there was a time, and they didn't want to do it. And the band had apparently taken some sort of stance on this, and they had gotten some death threats around this stance. And there was somebody who had threatened the band at a particular concert and said, that it was, if they stood up and played the song Pride, that was showing that they were on the side of a black man and they were going to kill Bono. So needless to say, they played that song, and the story has it that Bono sang that song with his eyes closed. And when he opened them, Adam Clayton, another band member, was standing in front of him. Now, as the internet is prone to, there's some credibility questions around this story, but I like the story nonetheless because it has a literal example of a moment where taking a stance for love means putting your life on the line and then putting it on the line for a friend at the same time. Regardless of whether we are literally laying down our lives, Jesus' message is clear. We are to love. Love without limit, love without qualification, love without requirements, love without exception, Now, love is not this sort of like romantic, warm, fuzzy kind of a thing. It is an action word. It is actively using the right pronouns. It is actively sharing what we have with the least of these. It is actively walking on the sidewalk and putting someone on the inside instead of out by the cars that are whizzing by. It is reaching out actively to someone you know who is grieving and saying, I haven't forgotten. I know you are there. That is what makes a friend. That is what Jesus calls us to. That is what it means to be a friend like Jesus is a friend. And that is what we are called to be about. Let's do that. Amen.